Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Populism is in vogue these days, typically understood as nationalistic, anti-globalist, and playing on prejudices of majorities with certain countries. Populism is cited as being the politics of the likes of Donald Trump in the US, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Narendra Modi in India, and so on. But there is other forms of populism that have different identity bases and operate in different contexts. In the Lebanese context, with a much more religiously sectarian and fragmented political landscape, political populism constitutes itself within a religious and confessional politics. While much work has been done on Christian and Shiite confessional politics, there is also a Sunni, specifically Salafist brand of politics in operation in Lebanon. Helping us to make sense of all of this is Giulia Gozzini. I've pronounced the name wrong, sorry. um,
That's Thanks for
Giulia,
having me.
well, sorry about the pronunciation. I've got your bio here
No
too.
worries.
You might
No
want
worries.
to.
That's fine.
So Giulia Gonzini.
Gozzini.
Gozzini. Giulia Gozzini is a PhD candidate in Islamic Studies at Lund University. She holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern and North African politics from the University of Turin and a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Florence. As part of her master's program, Giulia completed her Erasmus exchange at the University of St. Joseph in Beirut, St. Joseph. Has also worked as a junior research fellow in Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Africa at the Italian Foreign Policy Program at the Institute Affari Internazionale, as in a member of the editorial board of Maidan. Her research investigates the concept of Islamic populism, and focuses on the study of Sunni Islamist movements in Lebanon, with a specific emphasis on the ideological and political evolution of contemporary Salafism, particularly in the context of the city of Tripoli. Her work, she proposes to adopt a concept of populism, considering it an overlooked nexus between populism and religion, to investigate how religion and political populism relates to ideological and social formation of Salafism. Giulia, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me, Osman.
And it is our pleasure to have you. Let's sort of begin right at the beginning. What actually drew you to want to, just study the Middle East generally? I mean, obviously, we've got a study on Salafism and so on that you've done. But even before we get there, what actually made you interested in this region to begin with?
Well, I think it simply happened. There is no rational reason behind it. I was really fascinated by the region, generally speaking. And since the very beginning of my studies in international politics, I was really interested in the overlapping between religion and politics. And I think that from the Islamic perspective, there was something truly, truly fascinating. At the beginning of my research career, I started looking at the Muslim Brotherhood, generally speaking, with a focus on Egypt initially. And then when I started the master's degree, I discovered Lebanon, and I started looking at Lebanon as a country where this kind of overlapping was kind of constitutive of the country itself, not only from the political perspective, but even from the social political perspective. And I found it extremely, extremely thought-provoking and fascinating. And during my master, I started diving into the dynamics of the Sunni community, because when looking at the literature on Lebanon, it's striking that not so much attention was devoted to the study of Sunni Islamism and generally the dynamics of the Sunni community, despite being extremely relevant for the contemporary politics of Lebanon. So most of the studies usually are centered on Hezbollah and the Shia, the political Shiism kind of trajectory. And most of the time, I mean, the focus is on Beirut as the capital city. So I started just exploring what was happening within the Sunni community, and I found out that the community was undergoing a kind of existential crisis, I would say, especially starting from 2005. And this has created new spaces both in the political and the religious field for alternative leaderships and alternative actors, which have progressively employed kind of populist rhetoric and narratives. And so starting from this and starting from retracing the multiple crises that have affected the community, I discovered the context of Tripoli as a truly inspiring context because Tripoli is a kind of microcosm where we can observe many different dynamics that are undergoing not only in Lebanon, but also in the region more broadly. And where these dynamics, which were inherent from the Sunni community, found a kind of exacerbated and paroxystic kind of manifestations. And so, with the master thesis, I focused on the emergence of populist winds within the political field in the Sunni community. And with my PhD project, I'm looking at the emergence of populist forms of religiosity within the religious field in the Sunni community. And I focused my attention on the context of Tripoli, where I'm looking at the dynamics and the evolution of contemporary Salafism, as you said.
It's it's an interesting field. So when you sort of, I mean, you've done, obviously you're not doing your PhD on it, but you started with your master's. But when you were sort of doing this sort of research, how did you sort of go about sort of doing that research? Did you, for example, obviously you read articles and so on, but did you sort of travel to Tripoli? Did you do interviews? How did you sort of conduct the research?
I mean, of course, the basis of my research were first a kind of acknowledgement of the literature that was existent, and as I said before, there is not so much. So fieldwork was a kind of necessary. As you said before, I spent some time in Beirut at the beginning, and then I went back to Tripoli later during my PhD. I must confess that due to the regional instability, my fieldwork plans were particularly, affected. And so I wasn't able to conduct a full fieldwork as was initially planned in my research. And so I moved to the digital space. When it comes to Salafism and the analysis of Salafism, I met some people when I was in Tripoli, not for formal interviews, but more kind of informal conversation that gave me an idea also of the context that I was working with and the kind of sentiments and feelings that were prevalent in society. At the same time, now, since I was kind of forced to revise my plans, my original plans, and I wasn't able to go back to Tripoli for my proper fieldwork, now I'm working mainly with digital data. And so I'm looking at the presence of the Salafi sheikhs online, the kind of discourses that they're building, the kind of sermons that they are delivering every week. And so I'm looking more at the narratives that they have been building throughout the years.
So this might be a good time now to talk a little bit about who are the Salafists. What is, we talk about Sunnis in Tripoli, but tell us a little bit about them. How did they sort of come to be? Who are they?
Now, first of all, when we are talking about Sunni Islamist movements in Lebanon, we are talking about a highly fragmented and highly diverse landscape. So this is true across the country, and this is even more so in Tripoli. So mapping and categorizing this group is something particularly tricky because these are ideologically volatile, are politically fluid groups addressing different kind of constituencies, pursuing different agendas, sometimes even competing ones, and receiving also funding from different sources. So these groups are not a unified bloc. They are in constant competition among each other, and each movement promotes its own distinct vision of Sunni identity. So even defining what it means to be Sunni in Lebanon is in itself a point of contention among them. When it comes to Salafism, again, Salafism mirrors this kind of internal fragmentation because this is such a big umbrella, a wide contested term in itself, and is not monolithic. So it is a quite diverse movement with different currents and different manifestation. Generally, when we talk about Salafism, we can identify three main strengths. The first one is quietist Salafism. So the Salafism that rejects actually political engagement and focuses on religious preaching, the da'wah. Then we have the political Salafism, which actively engage in politics. And then we have the jihadi Salafism, which I want to stress the fact that it's a minority within Salafism, which advocates for violent jihad as a means of transformation. Now, the rise of Salafism in Lebanon is closely connected to the history of Tripoli. Tripoli is the second largest city in Lebanon, and it's a Sunni majority city. So the 90% of the population is Sunni, with a 10% of the Alawite minority, which is a very significant minority. And Tripoli itself represents a kind of a bastion of Sunni political and religious activism. So over time, Salafi narratives have undergone a process of Lebanonization, in the sense that they have incorporated very local grievances despite maintaining their traditional universalist rhetoric. And these grievances are deeply tied to Tripoli's historical memory and the events that have shaped its history of political activism, contentious activism, and forge also its collective identity. Now, Salafism in Lebanon has been present since the 50s, but I think it only gained real political traction in the past 2 decades. And the turning point, as I said before, was 2005, with the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafic Hariri and the subsequent withdrawal of the Syrian troops from Lebanon, and also the gradual weakening of traditional Sunni leadership, and particularly the political decline of the Hariri family. So this power vacuum, as I said before, allowed alternative Sunni actors, including Salafis, to expand their influence. And interestingly, before 2005, also because of the structural limits imposed by the Syrian occupation, especially in the northern part of the country, Lebanese Salafism was mostly quietist. So it refrained from politics. But with 2005, we saw a progressive politicization of Salafi actors who started engaging in politics, but initially as allies of the new leadership of Saad Hariri, the son of Rafic Hariri. And this was essentially a kind of marriage of convenience, I would say. Hariri needed Salafi and Islamist support to mobilize Tripoli's Sunni constituency, which was traditionally less connected to the Hariri's patronage networks. And in return, the Salafis, of course, benefited from Hariri's protection and backing. Many were even able to return from exile in 2005, thanks to the amnesty law that Hariri strongly supported. So I would say that the assassination of Rafic Hariri in 2005 and the withdrawal of the Syrian troops created a kind of environment where different actors started competing to shape the Sunni political and religious discourse in the north. And the new challenge for Hariri was to exploit this Islamist mobilization while containing its expansion. Now, the Salafis, on their part, started adopting a kind of virulent sectarian rhetoric centered on the Sunni victimization. So framing the Sunni community as systematically marginalized and oppressed. So in my view, and that's why also my PhD project connects to my master's project, it is impossible to understand the political and ideological evolution of contemporary Salafism in Lebanon without looking at the dramatic decline of the Lebanese Sunnism itself. So after 2005, the Sunni community entered a deep identity crisis, disoriented, lacking a strong leadership, progressively losing faith in its own traditional institution, both political and religious. And this crisis was exacerbated by this widespread perception of victimization, of marginalization, politically, economically, socially, which was also fueled by the simultaneous rise of political Shiism and Hezbollah as a dominant actor, of course. And there are many key events that reinforce this perception, including the 2006 Lebanon war, the 2008 clashes in West Beirut, where the Sunni weakness was made painfully evident even in the battleground, if you want. So the Salafis tapped into that discontent, vocalized it, and positioned themselves as protectors of the Sunni community. And this gradual shift allowed them to progressively break away from their previous dependence on Hariri, making them, by 2011, independent political actors. So the start of the Syrian civil war was, in that sense, a big game changer. And this was true more broadly, even regionally speaking, because the Arab uprisings marked a turning point in the politicization of Salafis. So with so-called political Salafis actively supporting the uprisings, and more generally the demands of social justice, of equity. And in Tripoli specifically, the Salafi networks immediately mobilized in solidarity with the Syrian people's struggle against the Assad regime. So at this stage, the Salafi rhetoric became explicitly populist. So they framed themselves as the voice of the Sunni people in direct opposition to what they saw as a corrupt, as a detached elite, Sunni elite. The state itself became the enemy, with Salafi preachers increasingly embracing anti-establishment stance, portraying Lebanon's institutions as complicit in the Sunni marginalization. And the most severe criticism was directed to Hariri himself, Saad Hariri himself, a failed leader, someone who had allowed Sunni to become weak, to become vulnerable. So this blend of populism on one side and sectarianism on the other side was particularly powerful in Tripoli. So many Salafis began using virulent anti-Shia rhetoric, portraying Hezbollah as the architect of a global conspiracy aimed at eliminating Sunnism. And this conspirational rhetoric was, of course, exacerbated by that sense of victimhood, where Sunnis are painted as victims of a systemic oppression. So, for instance, Tripoli's poverty and neglect was presented as a proof of an intentional campaign against the Sunnis. Or the city's deprivation is not just the result of government mismanagement, but it's a deliberate strategy to weaken the Sunni community. So, to conclude, I would say that we could say that contemporary Salafism has tapped into this widespread frustration, which was a byproduct of these multiple crises that have affected the Sunni community. And of course, the collapse of traditional Sunni institutions, but also the broader failure of the Lebanese political system created new opportunities for Salafi sheikhs, who started employing their religious narrative, their religious symbolism to advocate for Sunnis' rights. So framing their message around the themes of injustice, of oppression, and of exclusion. Now, we should also say that their popularity has declined in the years following 2013 for various reasons, and in part due to their ambiguous relationship with jihadist groups which were active in the Syrian context. Because on one hand, these ties attracted state repression, so with Lebanese authorities increasing surveillance, increasing arrests of Salafi and more generally Islamist figures in Tripoli. On the other hand, their proximity to these groups kind of eroded even the public trust towards them. So we are now witnessing a significant downsizing of Salafi influence, both due to the loss of popular support and also the weakening of their financial and organizational networks. But however, what I truly believe is that the deep crisis that Lebanon has been experiencing for years is kind of reactivating those same grievances that once fueled the rise of Salafism. And of course, the regional events could also breathe kind of new life into the movement.
So it's kind of interesting because, of course, as you sort of mentioned in the beginning, that Lebanese Salafism traditionally was quietist, and then obviously with the crisis of 2005, we start to see politicization come out into the open, also tied to the Syrian withdrawal, but also crisis. But I would imagine then, or is this the case, that there was perhaps a divide within Salafism because, on the one hand, you get people who feel that they should stay out of politics. It's a almost a, it's a kind of religious command to stay out of it. And then you've got others who are actively saying, no, we need to be involved. So was there not like a split here, or was this not something that we saw in the Lebanese context?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said at the beginning, the Salafi landscape is quite fragmented and diverse. This means that we actually witness the three currents that I mentioned before in the Lebanese context. And of course, I mean, they are in direct competition among each other, and they have very different views about their engagement in politics, wherever this means. Because we should also like question what does it mean to be involved in politics. It's not only about establishing political parties or like competing in elections, but it's also just talking about politics, talking about political issues when, for instance, addressing the crowd on a Friday sermon. But as you said, of course, I mean, there was a major split back in 2005, which is also connected to the kind of financial fundings that those groups got from Gulf countries. So I would say that, I mean, in the 90s, Lebanese Salafism was mainly quietist because of the structural conditions where the group was forced to operate, that is, under the Syrian occupation. And of course, a quietist form of Salafism was well welcomed by the Syrians who wanted to depoliticize the Sunni constituency in the north. And when this Salafism started being a little bit more politicized after also the Sahwa in Saudi Arabia, the Syrian authorities started being more strict in their surveillance over Salafi groups, and many Salafi actors actually were forced to flee from Lebanon. And that's why I referred before to the fact that in 2005, many of them were able to come back to Lebanon from their exile. Now, coming back to your question, I think that in 2005, there was this major split between the quietist field, which was mainly financed by Kuwait, and then the quietist, the political field, the political strand, which was mainly connected to Qatari funding. So, after that, I would say that the political strand grew in popularity. Also because the most prominent representative of the quietist trend actually were extremely close to Hezbollah. And they also signed a memorandum of understanding with Hezbollah back in 2008. And this provoked quite a lot of criticism within the Salafi circles. So in the end, the split is still existent. So many are extremely critical against those more political kind of Salafi actors. But those political Salafi actors are those who engaged more popularity in the end among Lebanese people.
That's interesting. So I sort of now want to talk a little bit more about, we've talked about obviously these Salafist movements, but I wonder if we could talk about some of the important individuals and leaders in these movements. And when we talk about the politics they were sort of espousing, what did that actually look like? I mean, was it purely focused on making sure there's Sunni representation in Beirut in the government so that Tripoli's voice can be heard? Was there a push for a certain kind of politics? So were they pushing for, let's say, I don't know, changes in education, changes in, social mores in Tripoli, then policy to enable that? What did this actually look like, and who are these individuals advocating it?
I mean, it's not so easy to answer to your question. First, because as I said before, when we talk about Salafism, we are talking about a space where very different subjectivities kind of operate. So we have more prominent figures that, of course, are representative of this current, but they are also representative of very different kind of approaches to religion and to politics as well, and they also embody different kind of political agendas. So it's difficult to make a very general kind of reflection on that. As I said before, however, a common trend is, again, the employment of very populist kind of narratives, which are centered, again, on the idea of the people as a moral community, which kinds of resonate, of course, with the kind of populist religiosity that Salafism represents in a way. And this moral community is built around kind of double dimension opposition. So it's not only built against the elite, but it's also built against the other. And the other is most of the time represented by the Shias and particularly by Hezbollah. So they don't have a clear political project or political program. They represent different types of populism. And I would say most of the time it's a kind of confrontational populism, in the sense that they are against, but they are not for something, or at least their kind of vision is not so structured. And from the religious perspective, of course, as Salafi actors, they are promoting a kind of purification process of the creed, of practices, and so they are denouncing the moral decay of the Muslim society, generally speaking, not only in Lebanon, but worldwide, I would say. So there is a crisis which is internal to the Sunni community, and it's due to a lack of, again, morality and a decay in religious practices. So they're supporting a kind of purification process, which also passes through the education, of course. But it's more a kind of, I would say, social cultural kind of revolution. When it comes to politics, the main topic is the opposition towards the government, the opposition towards the Lebanese state, which is deemed as a failed state, as an illegitimate state, and as an institution that is actually penetrated and infiltrated by the Shia power and Hezbollah, and as such is kind of reproducing this systemic oppression and discrimination of Sunnis. So the topics are multifold. We have a kind of socioeconomic dimension, where the poverty of the Sunnis is denounced, and so where sect and class kind of overlap. And the north, particularly, and the context of Tripoli, is denounced for its deprivation, for its for the mismanagement by the government, and for its poverty. So the lack of job opportunities, the lack of rights, the lack of dignity also. Then, you have the more kind of political dimension, where, of course, the criticism is towards the Sunni elite, but it's also, of course, against Hezbollah. And this brings me to a more kind of horizontal dimension of their populism, so the opposition against the other, where the other is represented by Hezbollah, but is more broadly represented by the Shia power, embodied by Iran mainly. So you have also a kind of regional dimension where Iran is denounced as the enemy par excellence, because it represents like the mastermind of kind of global conspiracy, which is aimed at eliminating Sunnism. So Hezbollah is just like an executor of this, global kind of project.
So when we think a lot, you've given us some ideas about this sort of populism that's at play here, but I wonder if we can sort of drill further into that. Because obviously when we think about populism, we think about politics in countries like the USA, Turkey, and so on. But we've also got an entire framework in the sort of political science field around what populism is and how it constitutes itself. How did sort of thinking about what you're seeing in Lebanon, how was populism useful in thinking about the sort of politics that you're sort of analyzing, the frameworks that come out of populism studies?
Now, first and foremost, as you said, I mean, the term itself, populism, is widely overused. So it is applied today to a vastly different range of phenomena. And as a result, it is even difficult to define populism as a clear-cut political ideology. Maybe it's not even an ideology. So I'm using populism in the sense more of a discursive repertoire, a discursive practice that, despite taking on different forms, has one fundamental common feature, which is this opposition between the people on one side and the elite on the other side. However, both of these concepts, so the people and the elite, function as what we call as empty signifiers, which means basically that these are empty terms that we could fill with very different meanings and very different characteristics. So the definition of the people, so who belongs to the people, the characteristics of the people, its ideals, its values, is highly fluid and so constantly shifting. And as a consequence of that, populism is an extremely flexible phenomenon that might take on very different forms across various contexts, but even within the same political context. So when we talk about populism in Lebanon, we must situate it within a highly specific political and institutional context. We could say that Lebanon's consociational system has enabled the emergence of populist movements that are rooted in distinct communitarian identities, so each competing for control over state resources. And in that sense, I would define populism in Lebanon as a communitarian populism. So unlike the traditional nationalist populism that we see in the examples that you mentioned, for instance, Lebanese populism is not centered on the nation state, but rather on sectarian communities. So the nation here is the taifa, so the community, the sect, in a complete overlapping of sectarianism and nationalism. So populist actors do not invoke the nation in the Western sense of a unified nation state, but rather they define the nation in explicitly communal terms. So Lebanese populism operates within the sectarian framework, advancing claims, demands that are based on communal interests. So in this context, the people is the community. And as a result, populist narratives in Lebanon are deeply intertwined with the sectarian power structure. Now, as I said before, my research has primarily focused on the Sunni community. And as mentioned before, the weakening of Harari's leadership, this growing sense of Sunni victimization, have created fertile ground for the rise of alternative leaders and alternative powers with strong populist connotations. And this is evident in both their highly sectarian rhetoric, where, as I said before, the people, that is the Sunni community, is defined in opposition to other communities, and mainly the Shias, but also their harsh critique towards the traditional Sunni elite, so with this vertical dimension, which is more typical of classical populism. And all this within a strong anti-systemic narrative. And this is true both in the religious and in the political sphere, with Salafi rhetoric representing a particularly clear example in that sense. Now, I think that this framework is particularly effective in Lebanon today because the persistent fear among communities of being dominated by others makes populist messaging, which is centered on the idea of distinction, of opposition, of confrontation, and even victimization, especially powerful. So this rhetoric is also reinforced by the country's extreme socioeconomic inequalities, widespread distrust towards politics. So Lebanese politics has traditionally long struggled to incorporate mass participation, so remaining mostly an elitist enterprise. And so in this context, populism kind of disrupts this model, no? Positioning itself as a vehicle for the people against the entrenched elite. And inevitably, this also resonates with the broader sentiment of hostility towards the state, which is often perceived as an enemy rather than a legitimate institution. And I think it also interestingly, even the Thawra, so the October 2019 uprising, can be seen as a form of populism, which of course in that case was cross-sectarian, so maybe closer to the nationalist type of populism that we are more familiar with. But the protests were characterized by very populist slogans. I mean, you will remember one of the most famous one was Killun Yane Killun, which means all of them, which encapsulates a total rejection of the ruling class, right? So I think that despite these unique characteristics, according to which we define Lebanese populism as a communitarian populism, in the end, the Lebanese populism shares key similarities with the examples that you mentioned before. So its rise is driven by the same underlying factors. So this deep-seated frustration with a political class that is perceived as corrupt, as detached from the people's real needs, a sense of systemic injustice, the effects of unequal socioeconomic order. And in Lebanon's case, populism is shaped, of course, by the country's sectarian framework. So it doesn't operate at the level of the nation state, but within distant communitarian spheres. And this makes it fundamentally different from the nationalist populism seen in places like the US, Turkey, or Hungary. But at its core, I think it remains a response to the same widespread discontent with a failing political and economic system.
It seems to me another thing it might seem to share with those other popularisms that were aforementioned is that, like a lot of these other popularisms, there's no necessarily grand vision of what the future ought to be per se. There's no even greater ideological vision. It's mostly a politics of crisis. We're in crisis. These are the people to blame. And there's not necessarily an entire solution to that problem per se. There's a lot of criticism of it. And it feels like this is what I'm hearing here, that there is a very similar approach here where there is no actual grand vision for what the future ought to be. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. As I mentioned before, I mean, you don't have a clear vision of the future. You just have like a strong opposition to the present and to what is represented by politics and by the kind of political order. And this is something constitutive of populism, I would say, even elsewhere. I mean, this kind of opposition towards the order, this anti-systemic, anti-establishment narrative, which actually is not grounded into a real political program, into a real socioeconomic program. And this is also, of course, the paradox of populism, which is anti-systemic, but you don't know for what is for, right? And that's the problem when, of course, the populist actors come into power and have to face the paradox of being the power after criticizing the power and everything that was connected to it. And that's also why I think that in the Lebanese case, it's truly interesting to see how these actors didn't establish a political party yet. And I think this is not a coincidence in that sense, because maybe it's more beneficial to stay aloof from politics at least formally, and not facing the contradictions of being in power after criticizing the power itself.
Indeed. And so, as you sort of mentioned as well, we saw a decline in Salafist influence in politics from about 2013 onwards, but there have been more crises more recently. Obviously, you've mentioned the 2019 uprising, but of course, we had COVID, we then had the Beirut port blast. and you had obviously the general financial crisis. And now more recently, of course, you had Israel's war on Hezbollah, which took place over much of Lebanon. So how has, these events impacted the Salafist movements?
I mean, as you mentioned before, the crisis is something from which those actors and those movements actually benefit. So it's not hard to see that the challenges that Lebanon has been facing throughout the recent years have only fueled and revived this populist rhetoric. And these challenges have also given new life to their criticism against the state and against the Sunni leaderships. In particular, I think that the Salafi rhetoric focuses heavily on the concept of corruption. Which, as you might easily understand, applies not only to the religious spheres, where it represents a crucial term in Salafi religiosity, which is kind of obsessed with the idea of purity, of purification, of the creed and practices, but also fits quite perfectly within the country's political and socioeconomic context. And of course, the diagnosis from their perspective is that this widespread corruption can only be fought through morality and a return to religion. Now, looking at the events that you briefly mentioned, of course, the economic collapse has hit all the Lebanese communities very hard, but its impact has been dramatically devastating in Sunni majority areas like Tripoli or the north, generally speaking, which were already among the poorest areas in the country. So I would say that Salafi groups have struggled to maintain their financial networks because, of course, they were impacted as well by the economic crisis. And it's also true that their decreased popularity and presence is also due to the fact that they kind of lost their financial fundings, especially because Gulf state kind of disengaged from Lebanon, frustrated by Hezbollah's dominance, and started stopping their kind of financial flows towards Salafi and Islamist groups, generally speaking. But as you said, moments of crisis only strengthened the kind of even dependency dynamics that the Lebanese system inevitably creates. And so many Salafi leaders were actually extremely active in offering forms of welfare, forms of economic support. So through local charities, the mosques, and even informal aid networks. They provided food, they provided medical assistance, education. So reinforcing their influence at the grassroots level. And of course, the port explosion in 2020 reinforced their narrative against the state, about the state failure, the systemic corruption, the unaccountability. And so the state is strongly condemned, is considered illegitimate, is considered unjust, corrupt, immoral, infiltrated by the Shia power. So I would say that the overall structural conditions that allowed the Salafi narrative to emerge are still very much in place today. And so the dysfunctionalities of the state seems to have worsened paradoxically, and this keeps the Salafi message quite relevant. Now, I want to focus just a minute on the Israel's war on Lebanon, because I think this is something really interesting from that perspective, because this is one of those areas where Sunni Islamists, generally speaking, and Salafis particularly, found themselves in a very difficult position. Because on one hand, Hezbollah presents itself as the leader of the resistance against Israel, which is a position that resonates with many Sunnis, actually, who genuinely support the Palestinian cause. But on the other hand, Hezbollah remains a sectarian rival. So how to combine these two different perspectives? Now, my impression is that Salafi leaders have generally and very skillfully avoided directly supporting Hezbollah. so maintaining a quite neutral and sometimes slightly critical stance. So they have criticized Hezbollah's role in the conflict now, but more generally in the Muqawama, the resistance front, arguing that the Shia militia was using the war and the Muqawama umbrella for its own political gains. Of course, however, Salafis have certainly stood in solidarity with both the Palestinian and, of course, the Lebanese people. And what is clear is that they have been extremely active in the solidarity networks that have been formed in Lebanon. And particularly in Tripoli, the arrival of displaced people from Shia majority areas initially caused some tensions that could have led to violent clashes. But Salafi leaders actively intervened to ensure that this didn't happen. So stressing the importance of offering refuge and support to the displaced, so long as they respected the customs and the religious practice of the cities.
That's kind of interesting, but let's talk a bit more about this because, of course, there was obviously a response to the war on Lebanon itself, but you also have the war on Gaza. So I'm sort of wondering, in terms of, their discourse and rhetoric and their actions, how did sort of Gaza and what happened in Gaza impact them? And then maybe afterwards we'll talk about Syria too.
Yeah. First of all, I want to stress something that maybe we briefly mentioned before, that the regional dynamic and the regional dimension plays a crucial role in Salafi rhetoric. So in that sense, it's super important to highlight that the construction of the people in this context actually blends different levels of belonging. So the first level is, of course, the community level. So we as the member of the Lebanese Sunni community. But then you have a second level, which is transnational and refers to the belonging to the Ummah. And this combination of multiple levels, so you see the local one, so with Tripoli and its own issues, the national one, so Lebanon and its own issue, the regional and sometimes even the global one, is something that makes this type of populism quite unique, I would say. Now, Salafi narratives, as a consequence, are full of references to regional events. And under the umbrella of the usual Sunni victimization, two central themes emerge here. So on one side, you have the anti-imperialism, so the critique against the West, generally speaking. And then on the other side, you have the opposition to Iran. So it's not Israel, the main enemy of Salafis, but it's Iran. And Iran represents the real architect behind a global conspiracy, as I said before, allied with Israel and the US, but it's Iran which is actually working to eliminate Sunnism worldwide, with Hezbollah being merely the executor of this plan on the Lebanese soil. So regional events are usually interpreted through this framework. Now, the war in Gaza and its extension to Lebanon represents one, again, of those areas where, as I said before, the Sunni Islamists find themselves in a tricky position. And this is because it's hard for them to reconcile their fundamental solidarity with the Palestinian cause with their strong opposition to Hezbollah, which has, over the years, and this also makes Lebanon a quite unique place, if you want, somewhat appropriated and monopolized that cause. So I would say that, as I said before, the ambiguity remains unsolved. Salafi welcomed the Al-Aqsa flood operation with great enthusiasm, so framing the subsequent events within this ideological framework. So Israel is condemned as a colonial state that cannot be trusted, alongside a strong condemnation of the international community and Arab leaders who have sought to make deals with Israel, sacrificing the Palestinians. And in this context, the Al-Aqsa operation is seen as an act of redemption, of resistance, so opposing oppression and serving as a means to bring justice. So in a general climate where Sunnis are portrayed as defeated, as oppressed across much of the region, This act is seen as a revival of the Sunni spirit and an end of the humiliation. And of course, this is also framed as a divine sign. But however, again, the relationship with Hezbollah's resistance remains quite ambiguous. It's not solved.
And of course, thrown into that, you had the events in Syria where in sort of December, Bashar al-Assad's regime fell, and we saw the rise of HTS, who are now in charge of Syria. How did the sort of Salafists in Lebanon react to this change?
Well, actually, they were quite happy about the developments in Syria. And I would say that after December, and so the fall of Damascus, there has been a renewed prominence of Salafis, who have built much of their rhetoric and their initial popularity around their staunch opposition to Assad. So it's no coincidence then that, for instance, after the fall of Damascus at the beginning of December, Salafis gathered at An-Nur Square in Tripoli for a well-attended sit-in, which marked a kind of return of Salafi presence in the public space, which had been more scarce and diminished recently because of the reason that we have mentioned before. And this square was back in 2011 the site of many Salafi gatherings, many Salafi demonstrations in solidarity with the Syrian people. So it was once again populated by sheikhs who were celebrating the victory of the Syrian people and the new leadership of Giuliani. Now, the victory of the revolution is interpreted again as a divine victory, which is carried out by Allah soldiers. This is the term that is used to refer to HTS fighters. And this victory represents again, the triumph of justice. So with the oppressed overcoming their oppressors. Now, it's clear that the Salafi leaders in Tripoli already had strong ties with al-Jolani himself. And this is evidenced by the fact that just a few days after the fall of Damascus, a delegation of Salafi leaders visited him and also the interim prime minister. And interestingly, I think that, the Syrian and also the Palestinian victory, because this is how it is framed by the Salafis, led Salafis to renew their internal demands, especially directed at the Lebanese state. So urging the state to treat the Sunni people justly, because this is the fate of the oppressors. And so the common thread, again, connecting these two experiences is the idea of justice and the idea of the rebellion against oppression.
Indeed. And so what do you sort of see as the future of Salafism in Lebanon?
Well, this is a tough question. I think it's very difficult to make predictions. I believe that we have to distinguish between two different levels of analysis. So on one hand, the movements, and on the other hand, the kind of rhetoric, the narrative that we have been discussing so far, and the kind of political potential that this narrative has. On the first level, so the one of the movements and the groups, these are groups that are extremely volatile. So they tend to form around a charismatic sheikh, and are deeply dependent on the political, the social, the economic contingencies for both visibility and, I would say, operational capacity. And as we have previously said, they represent a very diverse milieu, so shaped by very different actors with very different and sometimes competing agendas. So it is almost impossible to predict future trajectories here. That said, of course, the recent developments in Syria, for instance, will breathe new life undoubtedly into these groups. And also, much will also depend on what the new Lebanese administration means for them. We still don't know. But what I find more interesting is the second level. So the one of the discourse, the narratives, and its political potential. Because I think that when we look at Lebanese Salafism from a long-term perspective, what stands out is that despite some differences, contemporary Salafism has a clear historical continuity to past activism, and shows also the persistency and thus the significance of specific issues. So its success seems to lie in its ability to incorporate long-standing grievances that have shaped Tripoli's collective identity throughout its history. So the hostility towards the state, class tension, hatred towards the Syrian regime, and even sectarian dynamics. So what I'm arguing is that although this movement has at times been forced to retreat, the underlying grievances that have fueled its mobilization have never been truly addressed and solved. And so they remain ready to be reactivated. So in that sense, I think that this highly localized and deeply politicized form of Salafism is not just a religious movement, it's something more. It's a political movement, it's a social movement, and even psychological, if you want, because it resonates deeply with this contemporary frustration. And it channels this widespread resentment, this discontent, so exploiting the emancipatory potential of its religious rhetoric. And in doing so, it aligns with the broader global trend, right? So I think that this makes this narrative particularly relevant today, still relevant today, highlighting its enormous potential. Now, it is difficult to say whether this will translate into the formation of a political party. But the real question is that even necessary? And I think that this question becomes even more pressing in a context like Lebanon, in a political system like Lebanon's, where there is little incentive to engage in formal politics. Not only because establishing a political party and competing in election requires resources that these groups might not have, but also because Lebanon has grown increasingly disillusioned with politics. So remaining outside the political system while riding the wave of anti-political sentiment, I think that this is far more effective. So I believe that Salafism has tapped into this dominant feeling of anger and frustration, but I also believe that its apparent detachment from politics is one of its greatest strengths. So for this reason, I don't think that we will see the emergence of a Salafi political party in Lebanon. We will continue to see the influence and popularity of these groups manifesting in other spaces outside formal politics and maybe more closely tied to the street politics.
That's very interesting, and I'm sure there's going to be much more we can talk about in terms of Lebanese Salafism. But I sort of want to end on this because obviously we've talked a lot about Lebanon, and noting from your biography, you did work for an institute which was connected to Italian foreign policy. And I just wanted to ask you briefly, Italy is a very key player in the Mediterranean, or at least it certainly wants to be, and obviously developments in Syria and what's happened in Gaza. I mean, Italy was pushing for a ceasefire far before the US was publicly, in a way. So what is the sort of Italian positional approach towards Lebanon and Syria and also Palestine? What is the sort of things that they want out of it? What are they sort of pushing for?
I mean, I think that Italy's approach to the MENA region, broadly speaking, has been shifting quite a lot, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. Because over the past 3 years, Rome has significantly intensified its diplomatic activism within what is referred from the Italian perspective as the wider Mediterranean region. The new administration, the new Meloni administration, tried to relaunch Italy as a central actor in this geopolitically strategic region, trying to combine three different dimensions that are traditional of Italian foreign policy in the wider Mediterranean. So first, the energy security, and so the need to reduce the dependence on Russia's energy supplies, and this pushed Italy to refocus on its Mediterranean neighbors, especially North African hydrocarbon producers. Then you have the management of migration flows from Africa, with Rome actively involved on agreement such as the Memorandum of Understanding with Tunisia. And last but not least, the support for Africa's economic development through the so-called Mattei Plan. So with the new administration, we saw a shift in focus towards the southern coast of the Mediterranean and Africa. Of course, following the 7th of October, the situation has inevitably changed. Now, my impression is that Italy has largely adopted a very cautious and observer-like stance. So maintaining low profile while reiterating its condemnation of Hamas and its commitment to a two-state solution. So Italy limited itself to very general, very broad statements supporting peace without outlining a concrete strategy for contributing to a resolution. We should say also that unlike some European countries, Italy has also been quite hesitant about the possibility of recognizing a Palestinian state. And also, while it temporarily suspended arms deliveries to Israel, it continued honoring pre-existing contracts. And also, the funding to UNRWA was also paused, but later resumed. I would also say that Italy's good relationship with Israel do not always align with its own economic and strategic interest. The Israeli attacks on UNIFIL positions in Lebanon, where Italian troops are stationed, drew strong criticism from the defense minister Guido Crosetto. Economic considerations also play a role because Israel's military strategy indirectly affected Italian trade, especially given the disruption in the Red Sea. And it's not a case that Italy has joined France and Germany in the EU's Operation Aspides to protect the shipping routes in the Red Sea. I think that Rome has chosen, whether by necessity or political calculation, not to play a leading role in the Middle East now. This could be due to its primary focus on Africa, but also to the decision to leave the Middle East diplomacy to other European countries and to the US. And also, I think that Meloni's close ties with the new Trump administration will also influence Italy's stance going forward. I wanted also to mention that there was a clear effort to carve out an independent space from France and Germany. And a notable example was Italy's decision to send a chargé d'affaires to Syria just weeks before the fall of the Assad regime. And this move, which was supported by 7 European countries, which were mostly Eastern European countries, was completely independent of the EU foreign policy. And the aim was to strengthen Italian diplomatic presence in Damascus, probably in an attempt to negotiate the return of Syrian refugees in exchange for a gradual normalization of relations with Assad. But however, with Assad's fall, that strategy proved to be, I would say, a miscalculated political move, completely lacking foresight. So, and Foreign Minister Tajani swiftly adapted by meeting with the new leader, Al-Jolani, showing Italy's willingness to engage with the new administration to do business with it. And Tajani even emphasized the need to reconsider the EU sanctions over Syria. But what is clear is that once again, the focus of these talks was economic cooperation and refugee management. So I think that the conflict has inevitably forced Italy to rethink its strategic approach to the region. But that said, even if we look at the ceasefire agreements both in Lebanon and in Gaza, Rome is not in a position to be a key player in negotiations. It will largely depend, I think, on what happens at the broader international level.
Giulia, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you missed this one and would like to catch up or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.